Fine.
So, welcome to our new episode on mental health and psychology and REBT predominantly. And today we are fortunate to have our guest as David Ramsay Steele, who is an author and he has written many books. The one which I liked was Therapy Breakthrough. He has also written Marx to Mises, which is one of the that's the book. And he is an authority on Freud. He has explained that how Freud's theory is not what it claims to be in the book. So if you are interested, I will post the link below where you can go and read the book Therapy Breakthrough. And welcome, David.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So I want to start with first question, and that is, when was your first introduction to Freud?
When was my first introduction?
Yeah.
When I was quite young, I heard about Freud.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I was about 12,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw some references. Of course, I called it Freud because I didn't know any better at that point. So I read a bit about it. It didn't seem all that interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Later, I was in the company of people who were enthusiastic Freudians and who tried to persuade me that there was something in it, and I didn't see any objection. I wasn't strongly opposed to it. It was only much later. Basically, I think I'm not sure whether Karl Popper influenced me to reject Freud, but I certainly agreed with Karl Popper's analysis. That Karl Popper grew up in Vienna in the 20s and 30s, he was confronted by new and exciting theories, and he mentioned particularly three theories: Freud's theory of psychoanalysis, Adler's theory of individual psychology, and Einstein's theory of relativity. He studied all three theories, and he decided that Einstein's theory of relativity was different from the other two. And the difference was that the other two, Adlerism and Freudianism, the adherents of these belief systems tried to find confirmations of their theory, whereas Albert Einstein always pointed to the possibility of refutations of his theory. Einstein always acknowledged that there were certain observations that could be made, and if they were made and were contrary to his theory, he would abandon his theory. Whereas Freud and Adler, but let's talk about Freud. And after all, Adler was a breakaway from Freud. He was a dissident Freudian originally. So Freud, basically, the way he argues is to find confirmations of his theory. And he never addresses the question, how would you know if this theory was false? So Freud put forward all kinds of propositions which were quite startling, which struck most people on first hearing them as ridiculous and also a bit offensive. For example, a keystone of Freud's theory was the Oedipus complex, which says that every child wants to kill its father and have sex with its mother, right? A lot of people think that Freud only said this of little boys, but he said it of little girls too. But the difference with little girls is that by the age of 4 or 5, they discover unconsciously that they've been castrated, and that brings about a big change in the female personality and leads to something called penis envy, because these girls become consumed entirely unconsciously with the fact that they don't have a penis, and this is obviously a terrible handicap. The question is, how do we know that this is true? And one of Freud's tricks was that if you found this ridiculous and impossible to believe, this proved that it was true, because this was your resistance. We called it resistance to this fact about your unconscious mind. So Freud thought there was an unconscious mind, and he thought this unconscious mind had its own ideas, its own intentions, its own motivations. Now, I think there are unconscious processes which are at work in the mind, but I don't think Freud thought that these processes were just like the conscious mind, except that they were unconscious. In other words, they involved ideas about things, they involved intentions, purposes, goals, and so on, which I think is a mistake. And I think we know now that that's a mistake. So basically, when I read Karl Popper, I sort of agreed with his. He pointed out that there was no way to test Freud's major claims. And of course, there are all kinds of statements made by psychoanalysts. I should say, for those who don't know, that Freud's system of thinking was called psychoanalysis. So there are all sorts of claims that are made by psychoanalysis that are very minor and might be true, and might even be testable. But the main theoretical propositions of psychoanalysis, according to Popper, were untestable. An example that Popper analyzes at length is Freud's claim that all dreams are wish fulfillments. So if you have a dream, it's because of a wish you have for something, which appears in disguised form, because you can't bear, because it's an unconscious thing that you don't want to acknowledge, so you can't bear to face it. So that's it. So Freud's first sort of major success as a literary figure was the interpretation of dreams, which I think was published in 1900. In a sense, that's what made Freud, because Freud never had any success initially talking to the medical community or the community of psychologists, such as it was. He had a success with generic intellectuals who read books, and so that was how he made he became famous. So one of the main propositions of the interpretation of dreams is that any dream is always fulfills a wish. Now, there are certain obvious problems with that, and one is that some dreams are terrifying and some dreams are very unpleasant. So how can they be the fulfillment of a wish? And Freud kept on saying that he would answer that objection, but he always managed to sidle out of it, as Popper demonstrates by tracing the history of it. Freud wrote a number of books, but there were two which he revised several times, and they are The Interpretation of Dreams and The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. Those were books that he kept on revising, and he kept on trying to answer objections and to explain things a bit more fully. So, we have several editions of The Interpretation of Dreams, and it's clear that Freud really couldn't address this problem of how we can test the proposition that all dreams are wish fulfillments. Now, another example, which I think is an even better example, is how we would test the proposition that every little child has an Oedipus complex. And in fact, Popper didn't talk too much about that, but there was a guy in America called Sidney Hook, who is well known in various circles for different things. And he made a point of, he became opposed to psychoanalysis. And this was back in the days in the 50s when psychoanalysis had huge influence in, like all psychology departments in universities back then, were very Freudian. And most psychiatrists in hospitals were very Freudian. So Sidney Hook kept on asking these psychoanalysts, how would we know if someone didn't have an Oedipus complex. Actually, this is reminding me of a current case where there is, you may or may not have heard of this. There's a conservative person in the United States who, it's become fashionable among intellectuals in the United States to maintain that you can be any sex you want to be. There is a conservative journalist whose name is Matt Walsh, and he made a movie called What is a Woman? And it's a video recordings of him talking to various woke theorists, including pediatricians and people like that, who don't know that he's opposed to them initially, but they soon find out in the course of the interview. So he made all these interviews and put it together, and it's a very amusing movie. So he would ask all these woke theorists, "What is a woman?" And when and many of them got angry as soon as he asked that question. And this reminds me of Sidney Hook and the psychoanalysts back in the 50s and 60s, that when he asked psychoanalysts, how would we know if some individual had never had an Oedipus complex, a lot of them got angry. Some of them said that if someone had not had an Oedipus complex, he'd be an idiot, or she would be an idiot. But then, of course, there are people who are idiots for various reasons, usually to do with brain development. And that's not really, doesn't give you a way of testing whether someone had never had an Oedipus complex. So if I say that no one has ever had an Oedipus complex, that has never happened in human history, which I think is true, by the way. You can't falsify that with any empirical evidence. That's the basic reason for rejecting Freud. And because Freud's ideas are very circular, you have these preconceptions, you apply them, and that seems to increase your confidence in these preconceptions. And so you go through life like this. You keep confirming what you already believe and never really testing it. And the only way to test any proposition is to consider what might happen if it were false. That's really the only way to test anything. And the Freudians have never been, they've always been hostile to things like empirical investigation of which kinds of psychotherapy work, which is quite feasible to run tests on different types of psychotherapy and see which of them work and which of them don't work. And at the moment, I believe I haven't looked at this for a few years, but I believe the consensus is that all kinds of psychotherapy bring about some improvement on average, not in every case, but that the psychodynamic kinds, which are the ones closest to Freudianism, are the worst. They're the least effective of all kinds of psychotherapy. Whereas the cognitive behavioral types of therapy, like REBT, they score the highest. They bring about positive change quite rapidly in a high percentage of cases.
Yeah. So great. That's a very good introduction to start with about the Freud. So a couple of points which I could get from your first submission, that Karl Popper basically, who said that Freud's theory is unfalsifiable. Mm-hmm. That's the notion. That's right. Yeah. So that's what he conveyed. And one more thing is, so now I just want to go into the specifics of the things. And the first question which I want to ask you in terms of the specifics is, what is psychoanalysis? And can you just give it in a nutshell to our viewers, that what are its basic assumptions about mental disturbance, and what is its solution for this mental disturbance?
Right. Well, to put it very broadly, psychoanalysis is the theory that we have an unconscious mind which is very powerful and which can cause us problems. Because we have wants and we have intentions and desires that we don't want to acknowledge. And so therapy, from from the point of view of people who are psychoanalytically inclined, is an attempt to get they used to call their clients patients because they were pretending to be doctors. So the goal of the therapy is to bring out these unconscious events, and this is supposed to bring about a kind of crisis, or catharsis, as they called it, to use the Greek term, where people become aware of what's going on in their unconscious. Now, part of the implication of that is that what happens to you when you're an infant is extremely decisive for the kind of person you become. We've got a new cat here who's just visiting and is coming around. If you see a black shape that obtrudes itself, that's what that cat is. But anyway, so one of the things about psychoanalysis is that it tries to get people, it talks to people about their early childhood. So it's very concerned with how they got on with their parents, their father and their mother, and how they got on. And also, it's very concerned with dreams because it's usually considered by certainly Freud thought that dreams tell you something about the unconscious. Although the things that appear in dreams, according to Freud, they're always disguised. They don't directly tell you. So you don't have a dream about firing a machine gun at your father and then having sex with your mother. That is a dream that is unlikely to occur, not impossible. But if you have a dream, and there are sort of, there's a standard in Freudian theory, there's a standard set of symbols. For example, a gate is always the female, when a man is dreaming it anyway, is always the female sexual organs. A train going through a tunnel is a penis going through a vagina, and so on. Gold and silver, the precious metals, are always a symbol for feces, and that, if you dream about that a lot, it shows you had problems potty training. So I'm saying these things about Freudian theory, but most people who follow what we call psychodynamic forms of therapy today, very few of them now are pure Freudians. Back in the 50s, most of them were. There were a few dissident psychoanalysts like Jungians, but most of them were Freudians, and they took all this stuff about penis envy and the Oedipus complex. They took it very, very seriously and literally, if you can say that a metaphor is taken literally. But today, the orthodox Freudians, the people who narrowly follow Freud in all these things, they're a tiny minority of the psychodynamic therapists. But what they all have in common is a belief that your early childhood is decisive, and that you can't really be cured of a problem that you have, a psychological, emotional, or behavioral problem that you have now, unless you get to the bottom of it, which they think lies in your early childhood.
Okay. So basically, to summarize, what Freud advocated that, or what he proposed, that you have an unconscious which is very powerful than your conscious mind, and your early childhood is the determinant factor of your today's mental health or your today's emotional state. And the solution is to get in touch with that unconscious, with that long process of discussion.
Yes.
And once you get connected to the unconscious, then the catharsis happens, or you make it happen, and then your misery is reduced.
Right. I mean, one of the developments in psychodynamic therapy since Freud is with Freudian psychoanalysis in its classic form, it would often go on for years and years and years, and you would have people usually quite rich people, well-to-do people who could afford the time and the money, who would say they would have an analysis 3 times a week for 30 years. And of course, from the point of view of the therapist, this is great because you keep getting paid, and all you have to do is listen and throw in the occasional comments. So this is easy money. And when Hitler came to power in Germany, a lot of these people who had been Viennese Jewish, actually mostly Jewish, psychoanalysts went to the United States, and it was like paradise because the United States was a comparatively affluent society, and it had lots of people, well-to-do people with time on their hands. So there were rich pickings out there, and so it became so. Psychoanalysis moved to the Anglo-Saxon world. Since then, it's moved to various other places. For example, I've heard in various ways by various routes that it's very big today. Classic Freudianism is very big in Argentina. It has a huge following there. Why that should be, I'm not sure, but it does. But what's happened in the United States is that eventually it fragmented into different competing schools, and at the same time, the main psychoanalytic organizations became more liberal and broad in what they would tolerate. So that essentially it's a bit like some of the Christian churches. They believe anything, except there's one or two sort of basic principles that they stick to. And it's the same with psychoanalysis, which is like a church in many ways. There are differences now among the psychoanalysts, and of course Jungianism has comparatively come up now in the last 20-30 years. It's now much bigger than it used to be, and Jungianism, although Jung started out as a close collaborator with Freud, and Jungians usually accept things like the Oedipus complex, but they don't talk about it much. They talk about symbolism and myth, and that in a more. They're not so obsessed with sex, is one way you can put it. Whereas in the Freudian scheme, nearly everything, 99.9% of psychological problems are due to some bad thinking about sex. And many of Freud's ideas, of course, are now very much out of fashion. For instance, Freud took it for granted that homosexuality was an illness, a sickness, and it was something that, just like depression, let's say, needed to be cured. Freud thought that all oral sex was a sign of sickness, mental sickness, and various other things that people nowadays generally have a more permissive view about. Freud thought were terrible, and so Freud was a Victorian in many of his attitudes. So that has helped to make him narrow Freudianism go out of fashion.
So in nutshell, psychoanalysis helped to pay off the Mercedes-Benz of psychoanalyst.
Right. Yes, that's right. That's exactly.
So now I want to move further and ask you some of the claims or some of the basic concept of Freud, which were quite prominent to his theory. For example, let's start with id, ego, and superego. Now, when I read that explanation and when I hear that explanation about the id, ego, and superego, maybe you can throw some more light. That seems to be a very sophisticated concept. Rather than today's cognitive behavioral concept of preferences versus demand, looks too simplistic. Whereas id, ego, superego resonates more firmly when you read that. So can you able to talk more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the id is this part of your personality which consists of desires primal desires, desperately seeking immediate gratification. The superego is a bit like the conscience. It's a part of your mind that
It's kind of a moral compass.
it's like a moral thing. Tells you to restrain certain impulses, and the ego is yourself, your identity as a self. Actually, it's an interesting aspect of this, which a lot of people don't know, is that the terms id, ego, and superego are purely products of the English translation of Freud. He didn't call them that at all. He called them. He called the now I'm going to have to draw up some of my knowledge of German, and I may not get it right. But so the id, he called the it in German, right? And I forget what that is right now. But anyway, that's what he just called it. So the ego he called the I, ich in German, and the superego he called the Über-Ich, above I. But when Strachey, who did the authorized translation of Freud, for some reason, he translated these German words, simple German words, into these Latin words. So now when everybody in the English-speaking world talks about Freud, they talk about the id, the ego, and the superego. But it's Strachey who called them that, or it's Strachey who decided to give Latin equivalents rather than the German simple translations of the it, the I, and the over I. But anyway, so that's Freud's theory. So it's a sort of, there are different interpretations of this. It's usually assumed that the id is unconscious, and there's a rough equivalence there. Although there are some Freudians who would say that that's not quite, it's not a perfect fit. That there are some ego ideas that are unconscious and so on. So the exact relationship of these is a bit like the Christian Trinity. Some of the arguments that go on. But this is, and of course this does appeal to people. It seems, compared with something like the Oedipus complex, the id, the ego, and the superego seem closer to common sense. And another change that Freud made later in his life was to talk about a death instinct as well as there was sex, which was basically a life instinct, but he also had the idea there was a death instinct. Now, I think all of these things are, you can accept them as very vague symbols, but I don't think they're scientifically rigorous at all. I think that what we now know about the brain and the way it relates to mental processes, we don't find anything like the id. It's a made-up thing, like all of Freud's analyses of the mind.
Yeah, so that makes sense. Now, another, just correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard that Freud made another claim that children are sexually pervert. Have you heard it? Have you read it?
They're sexually what?
Pervert.
I'm not sure what you're saying.
Pervert. Pervet.
They're perverts?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Freud went through several stages in his developing his theory. There was a point where he thought that the language has changed. In the 19th century, everybody talked about neuroses, and that's a word that means a mental or emotional problem, but it's not madness.
Yeah.
So they talk about the neuroses and the psychoses. So real madness, where you become an axe murderer or something, that's a psychosis. But if you just feel perpetually anxious, for example, or depressed, then that's a neurosis. And of course, in the 19th century also, they had the tremendous obsession with hysteria. which was things that look like physical symptoms, which are really mentally rooted. That was a big theory. Now, of course, some of them were just genuine physical ailments, and the doctors didn't know anything about them. So a lot of people, especially women, if they had some physical sort of symptoms, the doctors couldn't explain it. They would say it's hysterical. It's due to the fact that they have some mental disturbance.
But now that claim is getting seconded now, with all the psychosomatic diseases and effect of your mental situation on your physical.
Yes. So Freud went through a period where he thought that that what caused neuroses was if people were sexually molested when they were very young. And it's an important part of Freud's theory. This cannot be when they're like 10. That's too late for Freud's theory. It has to be when they're 3, 4, or at the oldest 5. That's when it has to be. So he went, and this is called the seduction theory. And he held it for a number of years, 2 or 3 years. And then he abandoned it. And I think the main reason why he abandoned it was because no one would believe it. If someone had a mental problem, it was because they'd been sexually molested when they were tiny little kids. It's more believable if they were 10 or 11, but less believable that this is so universal. But that was then Freud dropped that theory, but without telling anybody he dropped it. And for several years, there was a period of several years where he didn't repudiate it publicly. But then now he had the theory that that it was still some sexual experience in early childhood, but it was a fantasy. It wasn't. It was an unconscious fantasy. You don't know anything about it because it's all unconscious. But it's an unconscious fantasy. So this would explain why you have these. Now, of course, there is a difficulty there because Freud thought that all little children wanted to kill their fathers and have sex with their mothers, and so he had to explain why only in a few cases, comparatively speaking, did this lead to serious neurotic problems. And so that was, but he had ways of trying to explain that. So this was it's part of Freud's theory that if somebody, let's say somebody says, well, when I was, so let's say some woman says that when I was 11, my uncle did something to me sexually. The Freudian approach to that is to brush it aside. That is what they call a screen memory, because what's really horrible and really upsetting you in your unconscious is something that happened to you when you were 3, and it didn't really happen. You imagined it, and that's why you feel so guilty about it, because you brought it about. But you don't know any of this. You see, it's because it's all unconscious. So this is the more mature Freud kind of theory, Freud had a very deceptive way of describing this. If you read some of what Freud, especially the later works where he's describing how he arrived at his theories, he will say things like this. This patient told me that she, by the way, the vast majority of Freud's patients were women. It's only when he became a famous figure that then people wanted the glamour of being one of his patients, that then you got some men muscling into the action. This whole system of psychoanalysis as it originally developed was men talking about women. That's really 99%. That's what it is. Freud would say in his written accounts, the patient told me that she'd been seduced by her father when she was 3 years old. and then he would go on to say, but I realized this was an unconscious fantasy. Now, about 80 years later, there was a man called Geoffrey Masson who wrote a book, and maybe some people pronounce it Mason, I'm not sure. But anyway, he's a well-known writer, and he wrote a book called something like Suppressing the Truth. It's something like that. Now, that's not it, but it's something close to that. He wrote a book in which he said that Freud knew that there was an epidemic of child molestation, and instead of bravely exposing this, he chose to hush it up by saying it was all fantasized by the victims. And so the feminists loved this, and that Masson, for a brief period, became a hero of the feminists. But the thing is this, what they all missed, both the feminists and Masson and the Freudians, was that the patients never told Freud that they never literally said to Freud, I remember this. Freud was the one who invented this story and tried to convince the patients that this had happened. And the more the patients rejected it and thought it was disgusting and ridiculous and unbelievable, the more he said that's evidence of resistance and proves that it happened. So this is, so when Freud says, she told me that this had happened, what he means is that she was suffering from depression or overeating or panic attacks or some kind of neurotic symptom. And his diagnosis of the explanation was that this had happened in their childhood. So that's the way they were telling him. See, it's like saying, if you're playing poker and you see somebody make a big raise before the flop, they're telling you that they had a pair of aces. Right? Well, of course they're not. They're not literally telling you anything. They're just making a. It's a metaphor. They're not really telling you anything. And this was what happened with Freud and his patients. So that the patients never, not one of Freud's patients ever told him that they had been molested when they were 3 years old. They came up with symptoms, and he said, well, the only explanation for that is, and that's where the story came from.
So now,
by the way, this is something that was staring everybody in the face for decades. Freud, at the time when Freud, a psychotherapist, especially with the leisurely pace of psychoanalysis, can only have so many patients. So Freud had less than 20 patients, and he said that every one of them had told him that they'd been sexually molested when they were 3 or 4 years old. This doesn't seem very likely in view of the fact that subsequently it almost never happened that anybody said that to Freud or any other psychotherapist. It almost never happened. But it's like some of the contradictions in the Bible or the Quran. You don't notice them; they're so blatant. So that's what happened with that whole episode.
So now I have to move further and ask you about some of the dark side of Freud and some of the things people are not aware of. And two incidents for which I wanted your explanation. One is Freud was a proponent of cocaine. He himself consumed it and advocated its use. And another thing is that he was party to some gruesome surgery to one lady. So can you tell more about these two things?
Oh yes. Well, these are well known, all the facts have come out. By the way, this is a good book about Freud. And if you want to read one thing about Freud that is not too short, this would be the book. It's Frederick. Who is the author? Frederick Cruz.
He's one of the Freud bashers and does it well.
He's one of the Freud. He resents the term, but I think it's a good term. I'm a Freud basher too. It's called Freud: The Making of an Illusion, and of course, that title is an allusion to Freud's book, The Future of an Illusion, which was about Christianity, well, both Judaism and Christianity, actually, because he thought of religion as a neurotic symptom.
Yeah.
Which I think, if you're going to take that line, then I think you can say that psychoanalysis is a neurotic symptom. But anyway, so Freud was a hugely enthusiastic proponent of this new wonder drug, cocaine. And he took it himself for, I think, 16 or 17 years. He was an addict. He appears to have later matured out of it. But of course, if you ignore the propaganda of the drug war, it's generally true that addicts do mature out of their addiction. But he wrote a lot of articles that were very strongly recommending cocaine. And cocaine was considered, it was considered a wonder drug in all sorts of ways. But it was considered a good cure for morphine addiction, which was already well known as a bad thing. Well, if you're addicted to morphine, the way to wean you off it is to put you on cocaine. It's a bit like putting people who are heroin addicts on methadone, which is sort of not quite so satisfactory heroin. Thomas Sars, who I have some admiration for, said it. That's like treating addiction to scotch with bourbon. So anyway, that's, yes, he was a big proponent, and eventually he realized that in fact he was a bit behind the times, because he was still saying that it was a wonder drug when a lot of medical opinion was beginning to turn against it and say, no, this is a seriously bad thing. Now, the other thing about the surgery was, until he became a really big name, Freud tended to try to pursue his career by partnering with some other person. And the two most striking cases of that are Wilhelm Fliess and then Joseph Breuer. But anyway, with Fliess had this theory that that neurotic problems were due to the nose. This thing, right, the nose, and that the nose was a kind of indicator of sex. Things could go wrong with your nose, and that would cause sexual dysfunctions, and that would make you neurotic. And so this overlapped with the cocaine thing. So Fliess thought that one way to treat neurotic symptoms was to put cocaine into the nose. And of course, if you put cocaine into your nose, it probably will make you feel better. But it's got nothing to do with the nose particularly. If you inject it into an arm or a leg, it will probably make you feel better. But anyway, so that was Wilhelm Fliess. And there was this period where Freud was like the junior partner to Fliess and was backing Fliess up. And so Fliess thought that in extreme cases of mental problems, you had to operate on the nose. And he did this with many patients. They operated, and he was a surgeon. Fliess was a surgeon as well, so he did the operations. And on one occasion, there was this particular patient that Freud knew about. I don't know whether he examined her as well as Fliess, but anyway, he knew about this woman. And Fliess operated on her nose, and after the operation, she had horrible symptoms, pains, and so on and so forth. And Freud went along with Fliess in saying, well, this just shows how deep-seated the neurosis is. But actually it was because Fliess, the surgeon, had left a long stretch of gauze inside her nose. And so, in other words, he was an incompetent surgeon. And if he was in the present day US, that would be like $500 million in malpractice right there. But of course, it wasn't like that in 19th century Vienna. Malpractice was just something that doctors inflicted on people. And there was usually little recourse, But anyway, so we've gone from one extreme to another, really. There, that was that. But he, after that, Freud didn't lose faith in Fliess, and he eventually came up with his super diagnosis of what was wrong with this woman. He said that when she bled, like from the nose or from some other part of her body, she bled. She was in love with Fliess, she bled out of longing for him. So one of Freud's delusions was that all these female patients were in love with somebody, usually the person who was paying Freud's fee. And then they transferred that love onto Freud, and they were in love with Freud. They didn't know this; it was all unconscious. But they were in. But all his female patients, eventually he arrived at the conclusion they were all in love with him, even though they wouldn't admit it. So Freud was a bit of a danger to life and limb, really. If you lived in Vienna in the 1880s or 1890s, I think it's a safe bet to steer away from psychoanalysts and Freud.
Yeah. Now, another popular figure today is Jordan Peterson. And
yes,
even though he accepts that some of the things Freud said were wrong, he also acknowledges his contribution, according to him. And he says that one of the important discoveries he made is that human consciousness is a sub-personalities. And one personality doesn't have control over another. And that is how that fact was explained by Freud. And now it has a sound scientific grounding also. So have you heard that from Jordan Peterson?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes. Well, Jordan Peterson, he was originally, and maybe technically he still is, a professor of psychology. And so he knows quite a bit about research into various psychological issues that was done in the 60s and 70s. He was at Harvard and doing some of this research. And so he's got an up-to-date knowledge of modern empirically oriented psychology. But he's also, there's another side to Jordan Peterson. He's a great believer in, much more in Jung than in Freud.
Yeah.
He's a great believer in Friedrich Nietzsche, and he's a great believer in the symbolic truth of religion, except strangely enough for Islam. He says he just can't make any sense of that. But with Christianity, he says, it's all vitally important because it's all these symbols which are psychologically meaningful to people. And he also says he had a debate with Sam Harris, who is a well-known social media pundit, as Peterson is. But Sam Harris, well, I don't want to just go around throwing around derogatory statements, so I won't say anything. But on one point where they clashed, they had there was going to be this big debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, and it was all ready, and they were ready to start. And everybody thought, well, this is going to be great. We're going to hear, they're going to bring out all their differences, and we're going to see, the rationalist and materialist Sam Harris versus the believer in symbolism and religion in a symbolic sense, Jordan Peterson. By the way, Jordan Peterson has since become a Christian and embraced religion in a more literal sense. So that was more or less predictable, I think. But anyway, they had this debate set up, and in the first 2 minutes of the debate, it became clear that they couldn't agree on the meaning of truth. And so they spent an hour or two just going over what was the meaning of truth. And everybody who'd been geared up to watch this great debate was really upset and let down because they didn't talk about any of these issues. They just talked about the meaning of truth. And Jordan Peterson has the idea that if something is highly meaningful to you in a symbolic sense, it's true. And Sam Harris would take the view, which I take actually, even though I don't like to admit I agree with Sam Harris on anything, but I would take the same view that he did, that you can say that, that if you read a moving novel. There's something true in it, but that's a metaphorical use, and there is a strict use of truth, meaning that a proposition corresponds with the facts, with reality. And Jordan Peterson refused to accept that distinction, and he couldn't see any distinction there, and so that's how that we ended up there. So Peterson is a very interesting character. And incidentally, much more perceptive and intelligent than Sam Harris, even though on that point, I agree with Sam Harris.
Yeah, yeah. So now, as we know that the Freudian era, he was at the top of popularity, and every major school had a Freudian
Right.
person heading the school. When the crack started to get to his empire, who were the proponent? We know Albert Ellis made a great revolution. So would you like to talk more about it?
Well, there are internal cracks, and then there is the rise of alternatives. So the internal cracks, there were people we now barely think about, like Erik Erikson, who had a kind of, it was broadly psychoanalytical, but he didn't talk much about the Oedipus complex. He had these, the more commonsensical interpretations, let's say, of some of psychoanalysis. Then I think the big crack from outside was what's the guy's name? The name is escaping me for a moment. He was a therapist who believed in just listening.
Carl Rogers.
That's
Carl,
right, Rogers.
Yeah.
Yes, Carl Rogers. That's it. So I think that was the really big. It made a bigger impact immediately than Albert Ellis did, so Rogerian therapy became a huge thing, Rogers thought that just by listening and asking obvious questions, you would help the client to arrive at some kind of self-knowledge that would help them. But it's very, very, unlike REBT, for example, it's very lacking in positive, suggestions as to how to go about it. It's more let the conversation take its course and you'll get better, sort of thing. But that was a big thing, and it's still big. I mean, there's still lots of Rogerian therapists around. But then you had Albert Ellis, and then sort of shortly after that, you had what's his name? The guy.
Aaron Beck.
Yes, right. So that grew more rapidly because it had that academic sort of backing to it. So now you can divide psychotherapy, I think, broadly into psychodynamic therapy, which is originally comes from Freud, but the vast majority of the practitioners are not orthodox Freudians anymore, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Not quite in either camp. Obviously, it's.
Hello.
Didn't think that you had to battle these unconscious things. So I mean, I would say generally my view is that the whole notion of the Freudian unconscious is inherently discouraging, because you're being told that there is something going on in your unconscious that you cannot control, you can't get to know about by any quick and reliable method, and whatever you do, it's going to frustrate you. So I think that's a demoralizing thing to tell people. I mean, I think it's false. I mean, I would tell people if I thought it was true, but I think I think it has a harmful effect in that way, because people, it's like it's like people who say things like, "I'm an alcoholic," and nothing can be done about that. It's that kind of thing. Change and improvement just becomes quiescent and
But some may argue, and in your book also you have said that Albert Ellis headed that revolution kind of way, and he made it's kind of a one-man revolution because he was fierce against Freud. He propagated his ideas quite aggressively. So what would you say about that?
Well, I think it needed someone to stand up and say Freud is wrong and here's an alternative. In fact, I think with regard to Freud himself, Ellis was quite gentle. He wasn't a Freud basher. He just said, we have an alternative here which works. And so, I mean, Ellis, I think, was a bit abrasive, and he lacked that kind of academic loss that carries conviction among the intellectuals. He's a very proletarian writer, I think, Ellis, and sort of rough-hewn kind of approach, practical, down to earth, and not too concerned about elegance. But it needed someone. It needed someone to do that, and I think Ellis had a hugely favourable effect upon all the thinking about psychotherapy.
Yeah. Yes, so David, it was a great journey. You explained the popularity of Freud and how his ideas were not linked with reality, and how the transformation took place. And now, more or less, we see that the cognitive therapy has taken over the therapy space, which is more empirical, more scientific. So thank you very much for your thoughts. I think they would be really helpful to people who are still in love with Freud. Probably that may help them to realize what is beneath the facade.
Yes.
And those who are interested more about this, I will be posting a link of your book Therapy Breakthrough, which will detail all these things in elaboratively, I hope.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much, David.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was good to talk to you.
Yeah.